Say hi. Can you say hi? Are you being shy? Hello, my name is Michelle, and this is What Not to Do. In today's episode, we're going to be doing part 2 about research. In case you haven't seen part 1, I will link that down below, and just feel free to take a look at it. I hope you enjoy it. In that video, we talked about everything you need to do in order to prepare your novel. Everything from world building to plotting, the kinds of research that you're going to need to go through in order to have a believable, well-rounded story. Today's video is going to be about the types of research you're going to do during the writing phase. Now, because writing is an art, there are certain aspects to writing that you will pick up and get better at as you work on your writing. Things such as your prose, or having better transitions, or having a good voice for your characters. As you practice, these things will get better. So I'm not going to be talking about those. Instead, what I'm going to be doing in this video is talking about a few specific examples that I've encountered writing my novel, just to kind of give you an idea of what kinds of things you will encounter and you should do research on and not just wing it. Now, that doesn't mean that researching and practicing your technique is not important. It very much is. It will make you a better writer. It will make your stories flow better. It will make it more engaging for your readers the better you get at your art. However, I'm just not going to really delve into that in this specific video. Painting. Now, in one of my earlier chapters, I have a character who was supposed to be a painter. It is a hobby, and it's also an emotional outlet for her to kind of express things that she doesn't have the ability to talk about in her life. However, I'm not a painter. I'm horrible at art, okay? It's just getting that out there. I draw stick figures for my games, and my players all make fun of me for it. So when I was wanting to have a painter character, that required a lot of research on my end. Because if she's a seasoned painter, there's a lot of things that she's going to know the process for. She's going to know what kinds of brushes she needs, what the brush's uses are. She's going to know what kind of canvases she could use. She's going to know what kinds of paints. Is she using watercolors? Is she using oil paints? Does she mix her own paints? If she does mix her own paints, how does she do that? You know, what are the steps involved in that? How does she clean her tools when she's done? What types of bristles does she have? Are they hog's hair? You know, there's a lot of details that I had to research and kind of understand how it worked, because that way when I'm writing her actions, it makes sense. It's believable. So I gathered all of this information, and then I picked key things that I wanted to actually include into the story. It's tempting when you have boatloads of information at your disposal to try to dump it all into there to make it seem like you know what you're talking about. But honestly, that just kind of bogs it down and makes it feel clunky. I don't need to say she was using a number 8 round brush and specify its exact dimensions and what it is made out of, because why would she talk about that? That doesn't fit naturally into a story. I could say she's using a round brush, and I could say what she's using the round brush for, but I don't need to go into all of the gritty details of it. However, I, as the author, need to know those details. Religion. I have a character in my story who is Catholic. And I'm not personally Catholic. However, I did want to be authentic. I wanted to have a Catholic character who is not just Catholic, but actually a good person. I know that sounds like, well, okay, why wouldn't they be a good person? But the truth is, a lot of stories that I read that involve especially magic and religion, they end up being on opposite ends against each other. You know, it's magic versus religion. And I wanted to paint that, first of all, these two things have nothing to go with each other. You can worship whichever religion that you wish to worship and still use magic. And number two, I did not want them to have an adversarial relationship. So, this character is a Catholic who is a good person, believes in God, and also uses magic. And so I needed to kind of decide, what kind of Catholic is she? Is she the kind of Catholic that goes to Mass and prays? Does she pray with her meals? Does she pray at night? Or is she something a little bit more in depth? You know, does she talk and use verses or scripture in conversations with people? And so I needed to kind of delve into that. I needed to know, is there some sort of iconography that she might have? Or some sort of memento or personal possession that represents her religious beliefs that she could carry on her person? And so I did a lot of research into that. Abuse. I know, it's a messy, complicated, just makes your skin crawl kind of topic. Some authors love writing about abuse. They will write stories with abusive households, abusive boyfriend and girlfriend relationships, or girlfriend and girlfriend, or boyfriend and boyfriend, depending on what the story is. And they don't have any problems with that. But me personally, it makes me tense up. It makes me feel uncomfortable. But it is something that is in my story, and because it's in my story, I needed to do research about different types of abuse. Because there are different tactics and manipulations that abusive people will use on the victims. It can be something like gaslighting, controlling, guilt, shame, humiliation, isolation, or it could go further and go into physical abuse. It can be combinations of these. It can be maybe one of these. It doesn't have to go all the way to the extreme. It can be minor. It can be subtle. It can be in depth. It can be hard. It can be painful for your reader. And I wanted it to, because I have abuse in my story, specifically with one character and in her family dynamic, I did not want to sensationalize it. I did not want to have some very harmful stereotypes about it. So I needed to do research and kind of then decide, how is this going to fit into my story? Animal traits. So my story has a lot of strange creatures. Whether they're demons or whether they're some sort of unseelie or seelie fae, they have animalistic traits. And because of that, I've had to do a lot of research about animal body parts, animal movements, animal footprints, how an animal sees, how an animal smells. I pick specific animals, and then I research that animal and figure out how to incorporate that into my story. Another cool thing about doing research on animals is it gives you good, clear weaknesses, because every animal has a specific strength or weakness depending on how it survives in nature. And when you base your creatures off of combinations of real life animals, then you can actually look up that animal and figure out, how does this animal survive in the world? How do creatures or other things kill that animal? So for example, I have one specific kind of creature, and this one is like a humanoid. So it's part human, part reptile, specifically part crocodile. And so I describe it as having a V-shaped snout full of sharp teeth and It's covered in hard green scales, and it has these slit reptilian eyes. And I needed to research, what do crocodile feet look like? Because if you are walking around and you suddenly see these strange footprints, they're not human, they're not wolf, and you're, not in a place where you would expect to see footprints like this, how could I describe them? So that not only does the character look at this and go, that's a problem, but the reader starts guessing and trying to figure out what is this creature that is in the story. And you also use the research to kind of come up with verbs or descriptors that match that specific creature, such as, whereas one creature might charge at an enemy, another one might lunge at an enemy. These two verbs can differ depending on what kind of animal it's based off of. You're going to use different words to describe the creatures, and I had to do some research depending on which creature I was working on to kind of use that right combination of descriptors and verbs and, make it fleshed out to where when you're reading it, you get a clear image in your mind of what this is. Combat techniques. Now, this is probably the most fun thing to do research on. Why? Because combat is fun. It's fun to write. It's fun to picture. It's action. It's progression. It's constantly moving forward. So it fills you with adrenaline just researching it. But there's a lot of information that you need to know, and there's a lot of little details that you have to think about. For example, what kind of combat are you talking about? Are they using a weapon? Is it unarmed? Is it magic combat? Are they summoning a magic weapon, or are they casting spells? Because, depending on how that functions, you're going to need to look up different things. If you're using physical combat and you're using a specific kind of weapon, it is a good idea to look up that weapon and how people typically fight with that weapon. Familiarize yourself with fighting styles and figure out what kind of ways you could fight with it. Is it a fast weapon? Is it a slow weapon? Can you get multiple strikes in? Can you disarm with it? What kinds of battle tactics are good for that specific weapon or that specific fighting style? These are all kinds of things that you're going to look into when you're researching about combat. In my story, I have a character who gets pretty badly wounded, and they are really only able to use one arm for the rest of the fight. And at that point, they're using a two-handed weapon, or a weapon that's typically two-handed, and I had to kind of figure out how could they use this weapon with just one arm. The character was a seasoned fighter, so it's not like they would just go into a state of panic. So they would have a plan, they would be able to figure it out, which meant, as the author, I had to figure it out. And in another chapter, I have a character that uses a specific weapon from a different country. And I wanted to know how to use that weapon so that my character could use it. Because it's a combat style and it's a weapon that I'm not really familiar with, but it's something that I thought was extremely interesting. So I looked up YouTube videos. I know. Making a YouTube video about looking up YouTube videos. No, but it's true. I looked up YouTube videos where it was people fighting, or I guess dueling, sparring, with that specific kind of weapon, as well as trainers teaching people how to use that weapon, so that I could kind of see how their bodies move, what that weapon is specifically used for, and that way when I incorporated it into my story, it felt more realistic. And the first thing you need to look at when you're planning either a weapon or a fighting style is, what is the goal? What is the goal of your fighting style? What is the goal of your weapon? Because I know a lot of people are like, well, to beat the enemy, of course, but there's different ways to beat the enemy. You could disarm the enemy, you could incapacitate the enemy, you could kill the enemy, you could bludgeon the enemy, you could cut the enemy. You could trip the enemy. It really depends on what the purpose of that weapon or that fighting style is. And once you kind of figure that out, that will make writing about it a lot easier, because you can legitimately picture it. If someone's throwing a bolus, that's going to have a different effect than if someone's stabbing you with a sword. So that's kind of what you use research for. I know these are just a few examples of ways I've used it in my story, and there is a million more examples that I could go into, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea, because I see a lot of people asking other people, well, how would somebody who is emotionally abusive abuse someone? Or how would this creature attack? And you can ask. You definitely can ask. I said that in my last video. Asking people, it's a great way to kind of get your noggin rolling, but it should not be your solution. You should do some research yourself, and it will help you, because the better you are at visualizing your story, the easier it will be for you to write your story. So you take all of this information that you've collected and you kind of put it in a pool, and then you say, what is relevant? It always goes back to what is relevant. And then once you figure that out, then you can start picking and choosing pieces to fit into your story to kind of give the intention that you want without bogging it down with statistics and I turned my arm to the left 1/4 of a degree, then I shifted and pivoted on my right foot, and I punched forward with my left hand. And, you don't want to get into that kind of ridiculousness, but you want to have at least an idea of how it works. How does this function? So that when you're writing it, it feels believable to your reader.